أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألم نشرح لك صدرك ووضعنا عنك وزرك الذي أنقض ظهرك ورفعنا لك ذكرك فإن مع العسر يسرا إن مع العسر يسرا فإذا فرغت فانصب وإلى ربك فارغب. صدق الله العظيم.
The Quran has made prescient statements about scientific phenomena that were later confirmed by scientific research. For instance, as regards to the structure of the embryo, the water cycle, our solar system, and the creation of universe. For example, the Quran revealed 14 centuries ago, quote unquote, "It's not permitted to the sun to catch up the moon, nor can night outstrip the day. Each just swims around in its own orbit." And it was later discovered by scientists that that is indeed the case. Each planet revolves in its own specific orbit. In Islam, there is no conflict between faith in God and modern scientific knowledge. But some topics like evolution makes people question their compatibility. Are they companions or enemies? To give invaluable insight on this topic, please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Shoaib Ahmad, who is formally trained as a chemical engineer and is an assistant professor at Zaid University in Dubai, where he teaches the natural sciences. He also has had some alumni training and is currently doing an MSc in Philosophy of Science and Religion at the University of Edinburgh. He is also Fellow of Science and Religion at Cambridge Muslim College. His research is on the broad contours of Islam and science, neo-atheism, and Islamic theology.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. So it's really nice to be back. I was here last year at COMSATS. It was one of my favorite places. I had a great reception and the team was just amazing. So it's really good to see you again. So I'll say assalamu alaikum again. Thank you very much for hosting me. So today's topic is, I know, one of the most controversial questions that come across Muslim minds. And my intention today is to try and make what is otherwise a very big topic accessible and hopefully understandable in a way that's easy and relevant to everyone here. Now, I know the chair mentioned evolution of Islam, so things like evolution of Islam I will leave towards the end for the Q&A. What I'll do is I'll cover across a few basic topics relevant to the topic title. So can you go to the next page, please? So today, what I want to do is cover 4 broad themes on the conversation of science and religion. Now, my perspective that I'm going to convey here in front of you today is just a perspective, number 1. So don't consider it as the Islamic perspective. This is just my findings that I'm sharing with you. Number 2, these are just some of the conversations that are happening in this broad territory. The field of science and Islam as an academic topic is still relatively young, like some other young scientific disciplines. So that's why the discussions are still quite slow, but the pace is slowly picking up. So the four things that I want to discuss today are, first of all, science and scientism. So my approach towards this is to make sure that if you are a Muslim in the 21st century, how would you understand the role of science in your worldview? So the first topic will be kind of touching across that. So the distinction between science and scientism is very important. Number two, miracles. So one of the most difficult and challenging territories is miracles. We live in an age of science. We live in an age of reason. Yet the Quran talks about miracles. How do we balance those two scenarios? Number three, we also have a huge phenomenon that started off in the late 1960s, this conception that there are scientific miracles in the Quran. So the Quran talks about embryology, the Quran talks about atoms. How do we interpret those? Finally, there is something called the decline thesis. So I'm not so sure if people are familiar with this, but there is a narrative that Muslims, after the Golden Age, you all have heard of the Golden Age of Islam? Yeah, it's a very important historical event where Muslims were at the height of civilization. They're producing great scientists and thinkers. And what they were doing is that since that time, the Muslim world is on a decline. And the reason why is because that science was eventually kicked out of the curriculum, out of the Muslim world, and now Muslims are at a low intellectual point. So there is a historical narrative here that I want to touch across as well. So we'll hopefully try and manage those. Everyone okay with that? Right? So please feel free to ask any questions, but towards the end of the Q&A. I'm going to try and hopefully go through these as quickly as possible so we can have more time for questions and answers. Next slide, thank you. So, let's start off with the very first one, science and scientism. So I don't want to stay and talk, I want to engage with everyone here. I don't want this to be a boring lesson. So what I want to know is, what is science? Who can tell me? All of you are scientists, no? Sorry. Oh, you want to speak on the mic? Oh, this mic. So, okay, okay, sorry. Right, okay, so, right. Who can tell me what is science? All of you are doing science on a daily basis? No? What is science? Can anyone tell me? No?
Discovering of facts.
Discovering of facts. What else? And can anyone else tell me anything? Otherwise, I'll start picking people. Yes?
Doing observations.
Huh?
Doing observations.
Doing observation. Okay. Yes?
Study of phenomena.
Huh? Study of phenomena. Good, good. Anything else to add that may be somewhat different to what has been said so far? No? Right. So, science is fundamentally a method, right? It's a method to understand the world around us, right? And we use all sorts of techniques and tools to understand. So most of you are engineers, right? Most of you are either electrical, computer engineers. So I come from a chemical engineering background, and in our field, what we do is we try to use all sorts of tools, fancy microscopes, a lot of computer software, computer hardware, to try and make sense of what's going on around us, right? That's what we do. This is what engineers do. Now, science is a method that's established. But what is scientism? Because this is a very important distinction to make. Scientism is an ideology. It's a worldview in which only science can answer everything. And this is a very fundamental demarcation to make. Because all of you heard of New Atheism or atheism? I'm sure you know about this movement, right? So what they like to do is they try to impose a conflict between religious people and the scientific community, saying that you have to be only one or the other. Now, Muslims, how many of you are scientists? Put your hand up. Or trained to be a scientist. Nearly everyone here, right? Most of you are engineering graduates or something along those lines. So obviously their narrative is wrong. Something has gone wrong in their perception. And the distinction relies on this binary. Muslims have no problem with science whatsoever. But Muslims do have an issue when it comes to science, the scientism. In the sense that not everything can be explained through the realm of science. This is the fundamental point that needs to be drawn here. So, to give you an idea, can you go to the next slide please? So, science, if you study philosophy of science or philosophy of religion, you will come across these eventually. Now, science is grounded on certain presumptions, okay? Presuppositions they're called. Without these assumptions in place, you can never get science off the ground. So for instance, Since most of you are scientists, you can answer this very quickly. If I drop my mobile phone, technically where should it go? On the ground. It should go down, right? Now imagine I did this 1,000 times. So you then get an idea, okay, maybe there's something governing this process. That whenever I drop something, it causes it to go down, right? So you come up with the theory of gravity, which is what Newton did, right? Now the thing is, here's the point I want you to understand. Have you seen tomorrow? No. Have you seen 10 days from now? No. But you assume that the laws that you have come up with that explain all the past observation unto the present will hold on the future. Does that make sense, right? That is a presumption you need to have in order to do science. Now why is that a presumption? Because imagine if I drop my phone, on one moment it dropped down, on another moment it went right, on another moment it went left. If there was no law to govern this process, would you be able to do science? No. So there's a presupposition known as temporal uniformity. The idea that past observation or past laws and rules will happen and occur in the future. So this is a presupposition of science. And why is this important to point out? Because if there are principles that science needs to get off the ground, that means science by default cannot answer everything. It has philosophical presuppositions that need further explanation. In addition to temporal uniformity, so temporal means in time, can anybody guess what is spatial uniformity? What does spatial uniformity mean? Who can guess? Spatial means what?
Space.
It's space, right? So if I drop this here, or in Dubai, or in UK, it'll always go down. It'll be governed by the same law. Again, that is a presumption that scientists make, that the laws are not localized, they're universal. So this is another presupposition that science is based on. Finally, number 3, generally, when we look at the universe, we see that we can create mathematical and scientific models which we can apply on the universe, right? So all of us, we've studied F is equal to ma. Force is equal to mass times acceleration, right? And we know that this works because when we apply it onto the universe, we do see generally that these laws hold. So in order to do science, remember science is an intelligible activity. It requires intelligence. The very fact that the universe is intelligible, it has a law, a structure to it, gives us an indication that there's order embedded in it, right? So this is a presupposition you need in order to do science. If you have no presupposition like that, science cannot get off the ground. Because science works with this idea that there are laws governing the universe, and you can uncover or discover these laws. So those are very, very non-controversial presuppositions of science. On the other hand, we have also limitations of science, right? There is a scope which science can give us, and outside of scope, it cannot enter certain domains. For instance, if you think of, imagine I have a drug, okay? I have a drug and I want to test whether it kills or saves biological activity. So if I give this biological drug and I test it in a microscope, and all the biological activity in that test tube dies, what can you conclude from that? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Bad thing. Now here's the thing. The idea of it being good or bad, did it come from the experiment or from you? From yourself, right? You cannot determine morality in a test tube. That is the point. Ethics is beyond the scope of science, but it is covered or grounded by the scientist who does the experimentation. So that is one out of several examples which indicates to us that science cannot explain everything. Now, again, I want to make sure this is crystal clear. I am not saying that Muslims are against science. This is the last thing that I'm trying to convey. I am saying that we are against scientism, which is the ideology that science can answer everything. So this distinction is very important. What atheists, particularly new atheism, what it likes to do is that it creates this binary, you're either a religious person or a scientist, and there's no in between. But in fact, there's a very fundamental problem between religion and scientism, but not science. So I hope that's clarified. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the next issue is miracles. Yes, so miracles is now a big question. On the one hand, we believe that we have laws that govern the universe. But on the other hand, we have a lot of miracles that are mentioned in the Quran. Can anybody name a few? What's one of the biggest miracles in the Quran? The Miraj. What else? What else?
The snake that evolved from a stick.
Yeah, so the snake that was produced from Moses' stick. You guys remember that scenario, right? What else?
Splitting of the moon.
Splitting of the moon, that's also a big one. Now, as scientists, that's a little bit of an odd thing to kind of consume. So we live in the age of science, but then we also have these miracles that do not seem to make sense. How do we go about understanding this, okay? So what I'm trying to do is give you some conceptual tools to make a few distinctions that can hopefully make the conversation much more interesting. So the first thing you have to understand is when we analyze the world through the lens of science, how are we analyzing it? Okay? There's a very famous distinction between philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. Now the distinction is very, very important, particularly when it comes to defending faith and understanding how science can work with Islam. Philosophical naturalism is the position that science only is pretty much the only thing that there is nature. There is nothing beyond nature. So philosophically, everything outside of nature does not exist. That is the first position. The second position is known as methodological naturalism, which is the idea the only thing that science can tell us is about nature. Whether there are supernatural entities outside like God or angels, it is not under the remit of science to address those questions. Now, when you have that distinction in place, the conversation becomes easier, because when it is told to us that nature is all there is, we're saying you're adopting the position of philosophical naturalism. But we can easily be Muslims and saying we interpret science through a methodological lens, but science cannot tell us anything outside of the supernatural. For instance, does God exist in space? Yes or no?
Yes.
God exists in space? The God cannot be found in time and space, right? Is he an empirical entity, a physical entity? No. So if God is not an empirical, a temporal entity, he cannot be understood through a scientific lens. So God is not an empirical question. That's the point. So we can still interpret the world methodologically as a naturalistic enterprise, but we can also believe that it can be coupled with other realities. And that is a fundamental debate that's taking place right now in philosophy of science. So to give you one relevant example, the director, she mentioned that we have the issue of Islam and evolution. You all know about this debate, whether Islam and evolution contradict or they're comfortable with one another. So one way of kind of easing the tension between the two is by resorting to this. Many people, when they think of evolution, they think that evolution is a naturalistic enterprise, meaning that we came from complete nature without any interference from God, right? And that's how even a lot of atheists pose it. However, we can simply say that maybe the material body of the human being came from the ground, but there are certain components of the human being that are not from evolution. So that is resorting to this distinction: philosophical naturalism versus methodological naturalism. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out within miracles is the idea, if you want to understand what a miracle is, you have to understand what a law is. Now, previously we looked at the laws of nature are bound by two things: temporal uniformity and spatial uniformity, right? Now, a miracle, once you've understood what a law is, a miracle is a disruption of those laws. So for example, we know that in the Quran it mentions or indicates that the Prophet, what did he do with the moon? He just raised his hand and the moon kind of split into two, and then it went back again, gelled together again. We know Maryam alayhi salam, she had a baby who was Isa alayhi salam, but without any human intervention, right? Without having intercourse with a fellow man, right? We also know of other lots of interesting miracles. For example, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was thrown into a pit of fire, but he wasn't harmed, right? So those are now interesting scenarios for us. So how do we understand miracles? And there's a whole bunch of literature on this. In very simple terms, can you go to the next slide, please? In very simple terms, to make sense of this, I think it is important to understand what is the nature of God and what He's capable of doing. This is a very important point to make. So in order to do that, let me first create this distinction. I know there's several distinctions I'm throwing at you, but hopefully they'll help you. So in terms of what God is able to do, it is important to point out between logical possibility and physical possibility. So is it physically possible from 1 second to another that I convert myself to a snake? Is it physically possible? What I mean by physically possible, according to the rules of science. Can I do that? No. But can you conceive of it? Is it logically possible? You can, right? You can imagine in your head that I can convert to a snake. How do you think animation is done? When you think of computer animations, from 1 second to another, things pop in and out of existence, converting to other things, no problem whatsoever, right? So the distinction between physically possible and logically possible is this. Physically possible is whatever the rules are that are dictated to us by science. But logically possible are whatever those things that can happen that do not arrive at a contradiction. For instance, is it logically possible for this to turn to a snake? No. It's possible. Logically it's possible, right? Is it physically possible? No, it's not physically possible. Is it logically possible for me to create, or for there to be a monkey that came out of thin air? Is it logically possible? Yes, but is it physically possible? No, right? Now, what is God able to do? The physically possible or the logically possible? The logically possible, right? He does what is logically possible. So as long as it's not a contradiction, God can do it. And for those, how many of you know Venn diagrams? You're all mathematics, I'm sure you know what Venn diagrams are. So that is a small Venn diagram that I've put up there. So physically possible things are a subcategory of whatever is logically possible. So as long as it's in the bracket of logical possibility, it is possible for God to do. Now how do we then interpret laws of nature and miracles given these distinctions? Quite clearly. So if you study Islamic theology or generally philosophy, we know that laws of nature are what God manifests as a regularity in nature. Okay? He's imposed regularity in the universe for us to discover Him. Okay? But it is in His absolute right to disrupt that if He so wills. So, for example, we know that we have miracles like the moon splitting. We have that, right? Is it possible for God to do that? Yes, it's possible. So for that particular moment, it is not inconceivable, logically, for Him to have done this. So even though we have these miracles, they do not necessarily violate anything we know in Islam. Now, when we have science, God doesn't say stop doing science. God said He manifested order, but He put these miracles in place to prove to a particular community of His power. That was the role and function of these miracles in the Quran. So right now, do we see miracles happening? Not necessarily, right? The only miracle we have left from the Prophet ﷺ is the Quran. And the primary miracle that we know of is not any physical miracle like breaking the moon or something like that. It is the literary miraculous of the Arabic language of the Quran. That's what grounds the Islamic worldview. So that is an important point to make out when understanding laws of nature and miracles, and how we can understand both of them in light of what God is capable of doing. Next slide, please. Right, now this is a very interesting one, right? So have all of you heard of these scientific miracles in the Quran, right? I'm guessing they're available everywhere, in pamphlets, in dawah stalls, all sorts of stuff has happened. There's an explosion of literature on this. So even here, my personal position is that we need to be very, very careful with this movement. Primarily because it is a very weak position to hold on to. In order to clarify my stance on this, I think it's important to point out 3 different verses, or 3 kinds of verses, which talk about science in the Quran. Number 1, you have verses which violate the science or physical laws that we know of. For instance, the moon splitting down, right? You've all heard of that. Number 2, we have verses which contain apparent scientific facts. Apparently, they have some problems with them, which we'll look into. And number 3, we have verses which contain scientific miracles. And I'm going to just briefly review each of them. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Right, so the very first verse, this idea that there are verses which violate the laws of nature. So these are a couple of examples. The moon splitting in half. We have Maryam's asexual pregnancy, and we also have Ibrahim, he was left unharmed from the fire. all of these verses violate scientific law, or they don't make sense in terms of scientific conformity, right? So this is one kind of category. Can you go to the next slide, please? So these are verses in the Quran which apparently contradict the science. So for those of you who understand a little bit of Arabic, 7 heavens, this is mentioned throughout the Quran. Sab'a samawat, right? It's mentioned a lot of times in the Quran. Now people say we only have one universe or one heaven. What 7 heavens are you talking about? Now, just a little bit appreciation of the Arabic language. The word sab'a in Arabic doesn't necessarily mean 7 all the time. Sab'a in Arabic also means a lot. So for example, in the English language, when we want to emphasize exaggeration, for example, we don't say, I did it literally, you will say things like, I did it 100 times or 1,000,000,000 times, right? You would use those numbers for exaggeration. The numbers of exaggeration in the Arabic language, in classical Arabic language, is to do with the number 7. So when it says sab'a samawat, it means layers of heavens. And these are not necessarily physical heavens, it just necessarily means layers and layers of things you may not know or we may know. That's all it means. So there isn't really a contradiction. Another verse that raises a lot of issues is the last one. You've all heard of the verse which says we made everything in 6 days, sitta ayyam. You guys have heard of this? So in Arabic, the word ayyam does not mean 24-hour days. It can mean any span of time. It could mean thousands and thousands of years. It could even mean a minute. It could even mean a day. In contemporary Arabic, it means 24 hours. But in classical Arabic, it means any time span. So these verses, they may have some apparent contradiction, but when you unveil the language a little bit, there doesn't seem to be a contradiction, at least when you go deeper into it. So this is the second category of verses. Finally, the last category, can you go to the next? So these are the quote-unquote scientific miracles that particularly are very implemented in dawah stalls. And I think we need to be very careful of them, right? So in order to explain this, my personal position is that there are no such things as scientific miracles in the Quran. And I'm going to try and explain why, right? So if you look at verses like, for example, there's a verse which says that the moon doesn't emit its own light. We know that it reflects light. You all know this, right? So the sun is an illuminator. It has its own light. But the moon is a reflection of the sun's light. Now the reason why that cannot really be a quote-unquote a scientific miracle is because if it can be proven that a previous civilization had this knowledge, it weakens the claim that this is a miracle in a very strong sense. So if you look into history, there were, before Islam, the biggest civilization were the ancient Greeks. And one of the ancient Greeks actually said, the moon does not have its own light, it reflects light. Now the moment you bring that into the conversation, to kind of say that this is a miracle that nobody knew at the time, is a bit of a stretch. Because it could be possible, it is in the realm of historical possibility, that some of these ideas were available even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's why to claim that this is a miracle is a bit of a stretch of the imagination. Point number 2. You know the fresh water and the seawater divide? You guys know of this? Yeah, so it says in the Quran that fresh and seawater and there's like a barrier in between. So this kind of place is not in one location. There are many locations where you have this fresh water, seawater divide. Now, for those of you who study the seerah, the Prophet ﷺ lived in a culture in which the most important job was what? Anyone guess? What was the most important job at the time? Or the most dominant job at the time? Trade. It was to do with trade, right? They would always buy and sell. Now, where would the goods of the trade come from? Anybody know? From? From the sea. Good. So the seaport of Arabia at the time was Yemen and Oman, literally at the bottom of the Middle East Peninsula, right? Now, where did those trade come from? Which countries? Anybody guess? Sorry? Egypt and so Africa, the continent of Africa. Anywhere else? Syria? Sorry? Sorry?
Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire. So that wasn't by sea, that was by land. Sorry? Excellent, well done. India. So back then it was Hindustan, there was one big continent, even Pakistan and India were one big country at the time. Right. there are several places where they saw the fresh and the fresh salt seawater divide. Now, if they were constantly traveling for the idea of trade, is it not possible that they could have seen it? It was possible, right? So to kind of stretch that this is a scientific miracle is not really a strong claim anymore. The point that I'm trying to say is that to make a claim that this is a miracle would mean that you have to show very convincingly that this knowledge could not have been known at the time. But when you look at it holistically, this knowledge was possibly known at the time. So to rest our case that the Quran has scientific miracles is hugely problematic. So in the English-speaking world, the number one dawah in the subcontinent is Zakir Naik. I'm guessing you all know him, right? The equivalent of that in the English world is somebody called Hamza Sources. He has a whole institution called Aira, and they used to run with this narrative. So they used to say that there are scientific miracles in the Quran. However, even then, 5 years ago, they retracted this position because they realized how weak this position was. To the extent, so the number one guy I said is Hamza Sources. He's converted thousands of people, traveled all over the world. He himself says very explicitly that because of this narrative, we even had some Muslims leave Islam because it was such a poor stance to hold on to. So, can you go to the next page, please? So, to kind of summarize this particular section in how to understand scientific miracles, we need to be very clear that these are not necessarily information that they could not have known. In fact, we do know that they could have known these things, which completely undermine their miraculousness. Can you go to the next slide? So the take-home message is, in Islamic worldview, Muslims have no problem recognizing that miracles do exist. Laws of nature are just continuities, scientific continuities that Allah has established in the universe, but He has absolute control to change them if He wishes to make His point. Right? No problem. Scientific miracles, by contrast, they rest on very shaky foundations because there are verses which contradict science. So I mentioned some verses which clearly don't have a scientific basis. For example, the staff converting to the snake, the seas raising. So to kind of focus, there are scientific miracles in the Quran, but then what about all these verses where there are contradictions in science? You can't kind of be selective with your scripture, you have to be holistic. They are certain, and there's possibility of backfire. So I think this is a very important point to take as a message. Finally, next slide please. So the final thing that I want to share with you is something called the decline thesis. Now, this is something that I wanted to mention only provisionally because I'm not sure if it's relevant for maybe the Pakistani context. How many of you can just raise your hand, how many of you have heard of Imam Ghazali? Put your hand up. Quite a few of you. How many of you have heard that he was responsible for causing the dispelment of science from the Muslim world? Have you heard of that? Put your hands up. You've never heard of that? Okay, so I will skip this section then to make it clear, just to kind of avoid that. So can you just go to the last slide? Thank you. Go. Last slide. Last slide. Yep, that's it. So that's it. I'll end my presentation there. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them on. Thank you.
If anyone of you have any question, you can ask.
Sir, the God show us the reason of those miracles and how do we understand that?
Sorry? Can you repeat that?
Sir, Sir, will God show us how He did that miracle, each miracle? How can He really explain us that to us?
What do you mean by explain?
How He did it?
Oh, so in terms of how He did it, we don't know. I don't think we can ever know. Remember, God is an infinite being. We have no clue how He looks like. We have no clue how He operates. Because remember, we are finite people, right? Our brain capacity is limited. We are, by nature, finite. In terms of how God does things, how does God create from nothing? This material universe never existed until He said, kun fayakun, let it be. So how He did those miracles, I don't know. We use metaphors and visual images to understand. the best thing that I can think of is like a movie image, like an animation. You know, you have slide by slide. I think of that when I think of miracles. But otherwise, I have no clue how he actually did it. Yes.
So I've got an example. We have this thing. We have this thing where we say that there are emotions and all these things are related to our brain. Like there's a specific part of our brain that controls the emotions and all those feelings. But then again, if we refer to Quran, it says that tatma'innul qulub, like their hurts were satisfied or their hurts were scared. So now science says that heart is just a pumping machine, and it has got nothing to do with emotions, with feelings, or being with scared or being satisfied. So how we being Muslims explain that? Like there's a huge contradiction here. How do we explain that?
So the concept of how we feel fear and
No, I mean the concept of this whole contradiction. Like science says one thing that these things are really related to the brain, the specific portion of brain. But Islam says that their hearts are scared, their hearts are satisfied. So they think that these emotions are really into that heart. But science says it's just a pumping machine, blood pumping machine.
Oh, right. Okay. So this comes back down to the distinction I made between philosophical and methodological naturalism.
Right.
So from a scientific framework. So remember, science, the scope of science is to understand the material world around you, right? Now, science can tell us how the heart works, how it does all of these things. But to say that everything can be reduced to matter is a philosophical presumption they are making. So in Islamic thought, we are made out of two entities. The body, which is one thing, and that has its own mechanics. And the soul, which has its own mechanics, in the sense that it is an immaterial reality. The function of your fears, of your emotions, are in that reality, not in this one. Now, science can try its best to correlate between your emotions and your physical features, but it hasn't done anything to reduce them to it. So, when, for example, in MRI scanning, yes? So when they will show certain images to the person on the MRI scan, and they'll induce maybe something like fear, any emotion you can think of. Right. And then certain parts of the brain light up. Yeah, certain parts of the brain light up. Now, they cannot say, aha, that is fear, because it's just neurons firing. Who is experiencing fear? The individual. Right. So there's a well-known position in philosophy of mind known as the hard problem of consciousness, which is this idea that science can only give you a third-person analysis. A first-person analysis it can never actually obtain. So for instance, imagine I'm drinking this water, right? When I'm drinking this water, science can tell me how the water travels all the way down through my esophagus, whatever this may be called. Rehan will be better to explain that. And it'll be able to explain every single molecular interaction. Right. But the actual experience of how I feel, science can never penetrate that. And this is a well-known problem in the problem of consciousness. Because you cannot reduce human beings to a material reality. And this is something that is a major problem in neurology, in any kind of neural studies, and also in philosophy of mind.
Right.
So when it says about the heart, it's not referring to a physical heart. It's referring to the spiritual heart.
Yeah. But sir, whenever we confront with an atheist, when I've talked to them, they say that in Quran it is written that your heart is scared or it feels satisfied. But in science there's no such proof of that. So being a Muslim, when I talk to an atheist, how do
proof of what exactly?
The proof of heart being responsible of controlling all these things. Or
no,
all
heart is not used in a literal sense. So this is, I'm thinking, relying on a translation. When it refers to heart, heart in Islam also means your mind, aql, not necessarily your literal heart. Heart is a very vague term in Arabic language. It can refer to your state of being. It can refer to your tranquility. It doesn't necessarily mean a physical heart. So I think that's a bad translation that they're relying on, not an actual fact in the Quran. Quran doesn't make any facts about the physical heart.
I think on this question, I also have a comment to make. Within science, you will find that heart has a cognitive content as well. Right. That heart has an ability to perceive. Although there haven't been many studies done on this, but there's a strong case that heart has an element of perception to it as well. So heart if we look at this and then try to read Quran hermeneutics, then we can see that there is a position that has been taken within science, which can then correlate with what is Quran speaking of fear and anguish and sadness. So that can correlate to some level. But yeah, of course, there's a part that is completely metaphorical. And then there's a part which is perceptive that is recognized by science, but which is not very popular.
There is mostly a confusion, especially in the tender age, when you're studying in a university, and there are people who are like, there are moments, especially the students who are studying in biosciences and like that, there are some moments where you are learning something and you are kind of contradicting that thing with what you really believe. And similarly, something that you really believe when you get some certain scientific justification for it, this is something which is very substantial and that will stay with you forever. So how we, from different fields, from different backgrounds, how can we perceive something and how can we comprehend something? We are all from different backgrounds. How can we relate that so that what we really believe, where our heart really is, can get somehow justified? Okay, yes, this is something which I believe, and this is some scientific rationale to it as well. So, how to have the harmony amongst both? This saddle state will always be there. What I believe is not there, and what's there is not what I believe. So how to come out of this saddle state, and how to be consistent? Ultimately, this will lead on to the ultimate logical journey, and ultimately this will answer so many questions.
So I think that's a very good question. So I think there's two components to this. One is understanding the nature of science, in the sense that science can never be an exhaustive field. By definition, it is just a materialistic explanation. That's it. And this is something that even Islamic ulama have recognized. The ulama, I mean imams, sheikhs, that kind of stuff, right? So this is something that's very crystal clear. With regards to, in terms of how to reach a harmony, the only times where we actually have a conflict is when we assume when we begin to adopt a scientism approach, where we begin to think that science can explain absolutely everything. Or when we look at science as a naturalistic enterprise that that pretty much says there's no supernatural entities. So in my personal opinion, when you go about trying to navigate the field, as long as you understand the scope of what you're studying. So you talked about you come from various fields. Every field will never have a complete 360 picture. We all come from these specific aspects. So to kind of state, I'm coming from this discipline and I've understood everything about it, I think is a very, very huge epistemic gap. One of the biggest drivers for us is that we always have limited knowledge. We never have complete perspectives. And keeping that humbleness, at least from an etiquette point of view, should always be checked. And always realizing the scope and the materiality of science needs to be distinguished. I think that is very, very important. And that for me has always been a constructive balance. Because I came from a very hardcore engineering background. So it was always about production. So I didn't believe in the soul. I didn't believe in things outside of the material framework. But slowly, for me, the solutions started coming up when I started doing philosophy of science and Islamic theology. Those are the two fields that gave me a lot of answer and comfort once I understood how to balance everything. The problem is, when you study in university, you enter a domain and there are these hidden presumptions or assumptions that are kind of given to you as you study the discipline. But what I studied from ulama is that there are hierarchies of knowledge. And each hierarchy and each element within that hierarchy has a scope and a limit. And the key thing is once you understand what those scopes are, what those limits are, understanding everything into a cohesive narrative, a worldview, becomes easier to understand. That I think is a better way of approaching the discussion. God knows best. Allah.
Do anyone have any question?
No? Everyone okay with Islam and evolution? Yes. Cool.
Thank you so much.
That's the thing on my side. Yeah. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shoaib, for delivering.